All right, thank you so much everyone for joining us for this month of African Liberty webinar. My name is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, and I am the managing editor at African Liberty. With me today to co-manage the webinar is my colleague, Bayon Lepesobi, who is a writing fellow at African Liberty and also one of our assistants when it comes to social media. And he's also a local coordinator for Students for Liberty Africa based in Nigeria. And our topic for this month is very interesting but also important when it comes to the political future of Africa. So to help us dissect this topic, which is about the coup in Guinea and ramifications for West Africa and perhaps Africa as a whole, are two interesting young advocates of freedom and responsible governance, Mr. Ovigwe Eguegu and Mr. Ndubuisi Ani. And I'm just gonna read their bio really briefly. So Mr. Sorry, actually doctors. They are doctors, not Mr. So I apologize for that. I truly apologize for that. So we have two doctors here, and so that's great. So Dr. Ndubuisi Christian is a professional researcher and advisor on international and African affairs. He is a senior regional advisor on African security and strategic cooperation, GIZKAIPTC, at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Center. Dr. Ani has specialty and experience in policy development. His publications and research interests cover issues on governance, democracy, human rights and security, conflict resolution, social cohesion, youth inclusion, and development. It's my singular honor to welcome the two doctors here to help us understand our topic today. So welcome, Dr. Ani and Dr. Eguegu.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Eguegu, are you able to unmute your microphone? I think I should have unmuted you as well. Or if not, I'll just do that real quick. Okay. Okay, yeah. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah. Perfect.
Brilliant. So yeah, let's just dive into it. It's going to be an hour conversation, so we're already running out of time. So first of all, when I saw the news about that coup in Guinea, it just threw my mind back to the foundation of the country itself when things were pretty much so chaotic. I mean, a lot of us know about the way France left Guinea-Conakry with pretty much nothing to work on because Guinea and Sékou Touré decided not to belong to the French community. And as such, France left the country with nothing to start government with. And of course, it was only Kwame Nkrumah and some other African leaders who came to the aid of Sékou Touré and Guinea in 1958 to give them money to actually start administration and start government. So when I saw the news of Alpha Conde's removal, it just threw my mind back to that chaotic beginning. So what was your feeling, Dr. Ani, when you first saw that news of the position of Alpha Conde?
I think for me, when I heard the news, from a continental perspective, I've worked with the Institute for Security Studies for a while, and we monitored the peace and security dynamics across the continent. It was quite surprising that we experienced coup again. Like the Guinea incident made it a little bit ever present again, even though we experienced that of Mali, but then in some ways people were like, oh, anyways, there's conflict in Mali and then this kind of situation could happen. But then when it's been experienced in Guinea, it's kind of brought to a realization that there's a bigger problem involved. And maybe if you allow me, Babatunde, maybe let me just give those two problems that are involved. It's like a tale of two coups that are happening on a constant basis and that are being ignored. One is being ignored by every other actor. So let me, first coup that we talk about is a constitutional coup, as in when leaders decide to manipulate the system, and make sure that they remain in power. And then by so doing, they cheat the democratic principles, and that is cool on its own. But then what happens is that those things are not being recognized, thereby making the other aspects of coup. Sorry, I'm hearing feedback, so I'm a little bit.
Yeah, I think that feedback
Yeah.
is perhaps coming from Bayonle's side, but I'm going to mute him for a while now.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
All right. Okay, good. So as in, it's a tale of two coups that we are experiencing, and then one is being seen as bad, and then the other one is the good coup. So I think it becomes very critical that we look at this, the root cause, which is the constitutional coup, and the problem that people create the opportunities for those coups to happen in the first place. Those coups, those military and overt coups could have not happened, but because of the manipulations by sitting leaders who are able to control the system, I think there's also, before I round up on this question, there's always that concern that people have that, okay, that there's a democratic process involved in constitutional review process and amendment processes. But then I would like to clarify that in a lot of countries where the political systems are let's say, controlled by dictators and also controlled by patronage networks, the election results or referendum results could be easily manipulated. So I will want to see it from that perspective. So when we experience the actual aspect of military coup, it is a reflection of what is happening of the political system and the democratic deficit in there. So thank you. Over to you, Babatunde.
I 100% agree with that. I mean, my initial thought was that this wouldn't have happened if ECOWAS has responded to the sheer, I don't want to use the word stupidity, but the greediness of Alpha Conde in going for a third term. I mean, I do not think Ndubuisi and his comrades would have seized power then. But I want to see what Dr. Eguegu feels. What was your initial thought when you heard about this coup?
Yeah, thank you. And for the title, Anna, it's no issue. I actually have my doctor title from health. So, but if I move into international affairs, but anyway, I personally want to start by first thanking you for inviting me for this program, able to share my thoughts and opinion with you all here. Very fantastic audience. And I also want to start by asking a question. If there's a coup in Nigeria tomorrow, will you be surprised? I'm sure many people here will not be surprised because we know that our political system is dysfunctional to what the previous speaker just said, constitutional issues, right? So for instance, in Nigeria, we have a constitution that's supposed to make us a federalism, but it's not operating as such. So you have certain regions of the country feeling like they are being held back by another region of the country, or some other region of the country think because they have a greater population, they should have a greater say, so you create a system where the country is not held together by a constitutional agreement that, quote unquote, says, we the people, right? So when we the people is not actually the people, but some people, then you really don't have a political system that is reflective of, the aspirations and the desires of the people. And that's one major structural issue. Then there's the power grab, or let's say the power dynamic to it that made me that for Guinea's case, I think was very evident, and that's the fact that one, there is no basis for saying a government can or cannot adjust the constitution if you have a referendum and the people clearly in the referendum, a fair and open referendum, not a cooked up referendum, and people actually say they want, because the thing about democracy is it is not by a rule that it must be 4 years and 8 years.
Right.
It means the people decide what. So the people sit down to say, okay, well, we're giving you 8 years. We think you should have another 4 years. It's still a democratic process, but that's not what happened, in Guinea. Yeah, and even in Cote d'Ivoire, where there was also a constitutional amendment, and Ouattara is already doing a third term. But these structural and internal political issues is one dimension to it. There's also another dimension to which is also external influence. Now, the reason why the constitutional change in Cote d'Ivoire is not leading to a coup, as opposed to, or even if it leads to a coup, there will be a very different response to that coup from certain parts of the world. And by certain part of the world, I mean France.
Right.
Is because there's a dynamic to it where certain coups are not punished or are not responded to in the way others are because of foreign interest. And if we look at the history of Guinea, for instance, or many of former French colonies or French-speaking countries, there is a direct correlation between coups and French influence. Because whether we're looking at from the assassination of people like Thomas Sankara, or even this Alpha Conde's case, or even this, what I would call even a coup in Chad that took place after Idris Deby died. So the AU did not respond to that coup in the same with the same venom that it is responding to the coup in Guinea, for instance, and even the coup in Mali, I think, has received the most condemnation. So aside from the internal political issues that countries themselves have to work out to ensure that there is no basis for the kind of military justification of power grabs that we've seen, there's also the need to also be very cautious of foreign influence that are trying to actually maintain their control of African countries. Then there's also the AU's part to ensure that it is consistent in its condemnation or in its charter on democracy and coup. There should be no exception. If you want constitutional order to be respected and democratic process as stated by the AU or even in the ECOWAS Charter, for instance, then you really do not want a case where you're like, okay, yeah, that coup in Chad, extraordinary circumstances, but the coup in Mali, not extraordinary circumstances, but the coup in Guinea, definitely not going to work. No, that's not. You have to be consistent, and the consistency is not out of principle, but also because of the fact that we don't want to reach a society where investors cannot predict, or even the citizens themselves cannot even predict what their government, whether they're going to have their government tomorrow.
100% right. I was going to actually come to the question of external influence, particularly focusing on France later. But since you already brought it up, maybe we just dive into it. So, of course, you're absolutely right. I don't think as well that the coup in Guinea would have succeeded if Macron was in good relationship with Conde. I mean, when Conde has announced the change in constitution to allow him for a third term, Macron was like, I forget the exact word he said, but he was so condemnative of it. And it's kind of suspicious that Conde haven't gone to France in the last 2 years leading up to the coup, which is an unusual thing as well. So you have a good point in that regard, that in cases where leaders are falling out with France, they tend to not be able to survive coup. But I want to come to you, Dr. Ani. Do you think the question of France influence in this case is something that we should be concerned about? Because not only do we have Mali, Guinea, we also have other African countries, Togo, Benin, numerous of them that are French. They are more integrated into the French financial and political infrastructure. So much that if there should be any kind of dissatisfaction from Paris against these leaders, do you think we can then be open to seeing like coups in those cases if France fall out with these other leaders in French Africa?
Yeah, it's a good question you asked, and then it's always a challenge that everyone has about to what extent France has influence in a lot of Francophone countries. And, you know, sometimes, let me just say, as a researcher also, a lot is also reflective that a lot is on the background, especially in the direct discussion between France and then the political elite. And a lot of those are also not made known to the general public in such a way that you could easily determine the direct relationships that you have there. Because in several countries, even in Mali and then in some place, you just hear of maybe when there's a disaster before you hear, okay, that a French national is involved or the French government is involved in that. So that kind of secrecy also fuels a lot of myths, about the extent of French influence in the background. But I would like to say that it's about external influence in African countries is significant and is everywhere. And you go through to a lot of countries. I don't see where external influence will not have hold in terms of development within an African country. So it's something that as Africans, it's always a talk about how can we sacrifice, for now, so that in the future we can have a proper independence, of all these political elites. A lot will be about conjectures. If I have to say, okay, no, that the French involvement in this direct also led to this. It's about conjectures that if Macron was in good term, and then it's also about conjectures when I talk about the situation in Cote d'Ivoire when Babo was in power as well. Some actors are talking about that he also wanted to nationalize and bring all the central bank components in the country, and then that's why the government allowed that he was toppled, But then I think there has to be a greater sacrifice, and I think the audience that are here today has to, think about what sacrifice can we make to achieve the greater independence that maybe our forefathers were not able to achieve at the time, because it comes from smaller impacts each day, and then it leads to greater impacts. Not condemning anything, but I'm just, one thing that comes to my mind is, for instance, there were a pay stack, for instance, that was developed, by a Nigerian, as in some payment apps that were developed in Nigeria, but this was easily bought by international actors also, and then it becomes their ownership. So for instance, a startup starts in Guinea or any other parts of the continent, and then an international actor elsewhere, maybe in the US or France, buys those. Those are the main aspects that have the specific influence, both in the political system and the economic life of the society. So there has to be that conversation. How do we break out of that chain? Thank you.
Interesting. So before I go to Dr. Eguegu, I just want to indicate that if any one of us have questions about the conversation, or you want to chime in, kindly indicate in the chat button or in the chat section, and I will bring you up. You'll have to, I'll unmute you, and you have to activate your camera to ask questions. But just let me know, just drop a chat that you want to ask questions. So let me come to you, Dr. Eguegu, and I'm going to go back to your initial thoughts on what you call maybe, is it the lack of response or unequal response from ECOWAS? So I see, I was looking at the initial, is it communique from ECOWAS when this happened, the condemnation that trailed it, the fact that they said, or whatever happened, we're not going to support the Dumbuya or in whatsoever way, and they afterwards sent an envoy to Guinea to go and observe the situation, and pretty much nothing changed. So, Dr. Eguegu, do you think the ECOWAS should or could have acted in a much more efficient way? One, maybe before the coup or during the coup, immediately after the coup? Or do you think the ECOWAS needs to rethink its modes of engagement with political situations like this? Like, do we always have to wait until the coup happen before ECOWAS can intervene? Or, I mean, what do you make of their intervention generally? Dr. Eguegu, are you able to respond? No, you are muted.
Yeah, thank you. So I was asking you to unmute.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So first of all, let me just go back to something Dr. Ani said. When it comes to coups, please understand, it's not a question of research. This is politics. This is coldly calculated politics. You always find the evidence after, and sometimes even years after. So in Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, you mentioned Cote d'Ivoire with Ovigwe Eguegu. Perhaps maybe you should read Greg Murray. He's a former UK diplomat. He covered the uprising in Cote d'Ivoire that led to the ousting of Gbagbo very closely, and you will see all of the French intelligence operations and imprints all over exercise. So we are dealing with the hegemon in West Africa. And before I even go to the ECOWAS question, we will not solve Africa's political problems. And I really agree with your point about Africa being able to have the control, because that's really it. See, we can't solve Africa's problems in terms of foreign influence without addressing the power imbalances and real power imbalances, not issues of GDP. I'm talking of state capacity to actually ensure national security and protect, national interests. And because you can't have spaces in the world where there is no hegemon. In West Africa, France is the hegemon. And almost nothing happens in this part of Africa without, French backing. Just look at the ECHO, for instance. West Africa wanted to come up with the ECHO. What did the French do? They got all of their, phonies and stooges together, and they came up with their own term of ECHO, trying to integrate Nigeria into the ECHO. We came up with the ECOWAS, and they came up with another kind of French institution. So Nigeria is the solution, and I'm not saying because I'm a Nigerian. Nigeria is the solution to the issue of political independence for West Africa, because we are the country that has the most capacity and closest to actually having real power to push France out of the country and displace France as the hegemon. Because we cannot sit down as 200 million people, or even, about 300 million people in the whole of West Africa, and 60, 70 years after independence, we're still debating whether our leaders are French-backed or not French-backed, or whether they have a full capacity to operate independently without getting some form of approval from Paris. So that being said, even the ECOWAS itself has a lot of problems, and ECOWAS cannot solve the issues of coups in a sense, if we are being serious, because it is not like the EU. Even the EU tries to be a supranational organization. The ECOWAS is really just a regional economic bloc to start with. What the arm of the EU call REX, and it doesn't really have full political power to go into a country and organize the constitution or solve the constitutional problems. So what I'm only saying I think the ECOWAS can do is to be more consistent in its application of its so-called charter that says democracy, democracy, democracy. So if, for instance, you have a president coming out to say he wants to extend his term, and there was no real referendum, or we know the referendum is not free and fair, using ECOWAS observers to observe those referendums, then we know for sure that ECOWAS should even start placing sanctions before that election for a third term. Because if you allow them to go into the third term, then you risk the Guinea case again, right? So it has to be a case of being proactive and not being reactive. And ECOWAS is very, very active. And it's the same script. There is the coup, there is the sanctions, there is a call for a transitional government, there's a call for return to, how do you call it now? There's this word they always use, and like this is just, sorry for the language, BS. We have to be proactive, and to be proactive, it means before the problem even starts, when and that's why I keep saying, let's look at the Gambia, for instance. When Adama Barrow came on, after we removed Yahya Jammeh, and I really say the ECOWAS did remove Yahya Jammeh, and that's a very good example of forcing these type of tyrants out of office when we know that they're really exploiting their power and to force themselves on the people. The ECOWAS did remove Yahya Jammeh. Thankfully, Nigeria was able to play a role. And what we had was Adama Barrow came in, said he was going to run for one term. Today, I'm talking to you, Adama Barrow wants to run for a second term. He's so scared of the military that he's inviting 600 soldiers from Senegal to protect him. This is the kind of nonsense we're talking about. So we can't even begin to understand the foolery in West Africa and the ECOWAS. What's the ECOWAS doing now? Nothing. It's folding its arms. When those elections happen in December, and then he's sworn in, and 2, 3, 4 months later, there is a coup, then there are the sanctions and the suspension from the regional bloc. This is not a way to conduct politics.
I totally agree, particularly if you consider the fact that in the case of Alpha Conde, Conde was at the time, I think in the last 2 years, one of the chair of ECOWAS. He was one of the chair, right? And if he was one of the chair of ECOWAS, I see no way ECOWAS could have sanctioned Conde for
Exactly.
for asking for a third term. But in the case of Yaya Jammeh, I think Jammeh pretty much created his own grave because he was so disconnected with a lot of ECOWAS leaders. So I pretty much see it like a as like a is it a if you're part of us we protect you, if you're not part of us we don't protect you situation, right? And it's just so sad that it always has to come to this gang style of leadership, not only in Nigeria, Ghana, elsewhere, but also in ECOWAS. But anyway, before I go to my colleague Bayole, I just want to remind people that if you have questions, if you want to ask questions, just indicate in the chat box and I will unmute you and you can actually ask your question directly to the guests. But we have a comment from our good friend Edith Magak, and she's saying Francophone Africa leaders depend on France for their survival. 3 days ago, Mali PM Chogo Maiga said in an interview that France and Mali are an old couple. There may be domestic dispute, but there would not be a divorce. Statement like this just prove that France and the West African leaders are happy in their relationship. I 100%
Exactly.
agree with you, Magak. It's just so much that a lot of West African leaders do not see the hegemony in play here. Maybe they do see, but they're just so selfish that they do not care about the consequence of putting all their lives, their money, their finances, their political infrastructure in the hands of Paris. But anyway, Bayole, I remember you and your colleagues in Nigeria were on the streets of Lagos to demonstrate during the NSAS, what we can consider Buhari's or Nigeria's kind of hegemonic political structure, and you rejected that. So I'm kind of interested in seeing your thoughts or hearing your thoughts on this situation in Guinea, and perhaps you want to ask some of our audience, I'm sorry, our guests, any of our guests, your questions.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for the opportunity, and I want to sincerely appreciate Doctor and Ovigwe for the very beautiful insights they have been providing to today's topic. I mean, it was Ovigwe who mentioned specifically the other time about Nigeria's position in displacing any of the hegemony that we have. And yes, Ibrahim, you mentioned the other time that until Nigeria, I mean, probably every other country realizes that there's an hegemony in practice and there's need for us to displace them before we can, I mean, take full grasp of our state's capacity to be able to provide security, protect our national interests, and then seek for the common good of its citizens. It will be difficult for us to be able to address the internal problems that we have even as individual states. The case of Gambia, having Barrow come in, and yes, ECOWAS is not doing anything now, and should anything strike up in Gambia to look like a coup, yes, we'll go back to the usual narrative. But of course, I think to a large extent, we are looking at a different narrative here in Nigeria, where, I mean, it's not going to be possible for anybody to hook up any form of hegemony without having to deal with the masses. It's going to be very difficult. I mean, over time, even though there have been efforts to, I mean, silence more people, bring in more efforts to silence people, more efforts are also being aroused to ensure that the people have their say about what operates in their political spheres. And yes, I like to place the emphasis on the integrity of leadership. You see, Barrow agreed to spend just a term. Now is running for a second one. If something like that continues, if someone like Obasanjo could not get, a third term in a country like Nigeria, nobody should be able to go against their words in any country of the world. Every
or Mandela.
Or Mandela in South Africa. Thank you. Nobody should be able to go, I mean, should be able to stand up against the state in any case. And if we don't continue to bring up structures that will help us to uphold these institutions, it will be difficult for us to move on with advancing the cause of the state. So for me, it will be the effort of this, I mean, ECOWAS, AU, helping states to realize that, yes, there's an hegemony and there's a need for every state leadership to key into integrity. And that's, I mean, that would have been my question to either of the guests, but probably starting with Dr. Ani, to help us, I mean, shed more light on how do we sustain the integrity of leaders in Africa to ensure that we're able to protect what is paramount and important to the state, so that we don't continue to have this, cycle of leadership, tussle every time. What would be the way forward for us to address leadership integrity in Africa?
Good. So can I come in?
Yes, please, Doctor.
Yes, thank you, Bande, for that question. I think there are a couple of things that maybe we need to reflect over and then think about. Two things. The world is not fair most of the time, all the time, right? There are a camp that are living on an unfairer world, and there is a camp looking for a fairer world. You know, it's always about which side will dominate at a particular point of time. Because then if you have a responsible leader or a leadership that is responding towards fairness and looking forward to what is just, what is good, then you will see more changes in that regard. And then the other side also will be looking forward for it. I think my own comment has always been that looking for that fairness has to always start from our personal reflections, and to also look at where are we standing in our affiliations on a daily basis, on a regular basis, to see, okay, are we standing on the side of fairness, and are we working towards protecting those fairness rights and all that. So that is where I will start off by saying that if we are looking for integrity, it has always been something that we know that it has to start from our homes and also leading towards our affiliations and to the political system, and then we move it forward in that regard. But then, as I think Ovigwe and Babatunde have also brought out, that the situation in Gambia it's a tale of a small country that is not in good books with Senegal, and then also with all other countries. Then it can be easily bullied. Then that fairness is now meted out in that approach. But then will this happen if it was, let's say, a stronger country that it cannot be easily bullied by countries within? How will we address that bit? That is something that we need to think about. And Babatunde, I think you asked a very critical question about what should be done, especially for constitutional coups, because I see that in my view, I don't see military coups as a big problem in itself. The problem in itself is the political coups, and the constitutional coups that are happening. And it's how you find a way to address that. And that is what supranational communities are supposed to be doing, like the AU and ECOWAS. The AU protocol on democracy, as in the Charter on Democracy and Good Governance, enjoined the Commission to always review every constitutional reviews done by member states. Every constitutional review is supposed to be reviewed in that regard, and then to see the legitimacy of it. But then this has not been done. This has not been tabled under the Peace and Security Council to look at how do we really address this, to say, okay, there's a constitutional review, it's on the table, how did the process go? Is it free and fair? Then we address it. That's one thing. The ECOWAS on its own side, the protocol it's been working with is that of 2001. There's a lot that has happened already. The AU one is 2007. There's a lot happening already that needed to be reviewed, and then to say, okay, constitutional coups, because the ECOWAS one does not have a regulation against constitutional coups, but the AU has a regulation against constitutional coups. But when you look at the scheme of things, the sub-regions are the ones who have the most influence, then followed by the AU, giving that umbrella perspective. And a lot of these days, it's more or less like developing norms and the likes. But then, currently, the people who are able to make real-time influence are the ECOWAS leaders on board. So I will say that those dynamics are things that we need to constantly review. And then when we come to, because whenever these things happen, I ask myself, what part will I have played, and it comes from maybe you're supporting a bad governance or supporting a regime that is not doing, and finding all the excuses for how its governance is in the right way. There are people who do that, who do that. While it's an issue of bread and butter issue, as sometimes as Ovigwe noted at some point that that people have to now start caring about, okay, is it day-to-day management of their own finances and everything, then they end up going towards a path that is unfair. So it's something that we need to reflect in that regard and see how to move forward. Thank you.
Analyst, your time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Ani, for that. And of course, that brings us to probably another point of our conversation. Agreeing very much with your position on being careful not to be able to fall, sway of being caught in the web of, defending something that is just unconstitutional already. And my fear is every time there is AU summit, there is ECOWAS General Assembly, we get representations, but we don't bring up these salient issues that affect our member states. And it's not only sad, but it's also laying the foundation for more unconstitutional coup or probably some other unconstitutional activities to go on unchecked in some of these member states. Yes, the activities of supranationals can play a very huge role if it is quickly addressed. For instance, yes, a lot has happened between 2001 and now. And of course, even the protocols of the EU, AU itself, and ECOWAS should be reviewed. If not, it will not fit into a kind of century like this, where we now have real-time issues, issues way back above the 2001 resolutions or protocols that it is adopting for its, various procedures. So for me, first, let's keep our internal mechanism running so that we're able to combat whatever foreign or external challenges we might be having. Now, my question will be directly to Ovigwe now to help us maybe shed some light. What would you make of a looming coup in any country? This could have been any country. It could have been Ghana, it could have been Nigeria, it could have been any other country. What do you think? What do you make of avoiding the next coup in another country in Africa?
Well, personally, I wouldn't rule out all coup as bad. And this is me being as blunt as it gets and looking at history as well. If you look at what happened in Burkina Faso, believe you me, if you were a Burkinabe before Sankara came on board, you won't be having the kind of questions of whether a coup is good or a coup is bad. But that's just one example, right? So the overwhelming majority of the coups we've seen on the continent have been really terrible, and that's because they've not been people-driven. It has not come from a true yearning from the people to change their government, and they are so powerless in changing their government. And then the military says, well, you know what? These guys are just messing the whole thing up. We just have to kick them out, right? We saw that with Gaddafi in Libya, for instance. We saw that in Burkina Faso. I would say to a large, extent. What happened in Rwanda with Kagame was a genocide, quite all right, but that was an extreme case, but that's a military leadership that rose up against a very brutal regime of Ibrahim, whatever the guy's name was, and they kicked him out. But the point I'm trying to make here is, under normal circumstances, which is a country has a democracy, fairly functioning democracy, and and some form of constitutional order, and some form and development, right? So you have a system that is working, that's creating public goods for the people. You really want to protect such a government at all costs. There is no basis for a military ambitious man in the military to come up to say, because this person did this or did that, I'm going to kick him out. No. So just to echo back on the points both myself and Ndubuisi has made, we just have to look at it. There are three ways or three approaches of the solution. There's the internal part of it where countries themselves, the political leaders and the political elites in each country, have the responsibility to first ensure that their government is legitimate. Because without legitimacy, if a government is truly legitimate, I mean, you have overwhelming support of the population. If the military takes over, there will be protests on the streets. I'm telling you, I'm going to give a good example. For instance, if you say maybe Mauritius today, not even Mauritius is too far. Let's use Botswana, or let's use Rwanda, where we've seen leadership that has been there for, in Rwanda, for instance, leadership that has been there for a long time, quite all right. But in that time, we've seen progressive increase, in development, right? If you stage a coup in Rwanda today, it will be very hard to justify it. On what basis? You say, okay, maybe he has been in power for so and so time, but he has been holding elections. If you don't like the elections, well, too bad. Go hold, leave the army and come compete against him, as opposed to using a coup to remove him from office. So, there is that. So we need government to be very legitimate and be really responsible to the needs of their people. And then secondly, we need, how do you say, the institutions, so whether the ECOWAS or SADC or EAC and AU, whatever, all of them, they should take their mandate very seriously. But one problem I'd like to mention is with the AU and the ECOWAS, the same leaders that were complaining about for their misrule are the people going to these organizations to set the rules. Well, except for the AU that has a very good parliament, right? But our EU parliament or the ECOWAS parliament is not like the EU parliament, where people directly elect the people, the representative to go there. So it's very different. We have a very different ball game. So the game we have is that the leaders that were complaining about, or that were scared of, or that have the people that can cause a problem, and people who are asking to solve the problem. Or in this case, the thieves are the people who are put in charge to protect and the goods that we don't want to be stolen. So that's why it's very difficult. That's why the example what Babante was saying about Alpha Conde, if the people, he was there, what do you expect him to do? He would definitely rally his comrades again and tell them, you guys better don't do this, because, what are you trying to do? It's the same thing. It's the same. So that's a major problem. So in terms of making the AU mechanisms and the regional mechanisms work better, we have to even democratize the AU and the ECOWAS even further, and give the ECOWAS and AU citizens, quote and unquote, ability to actually impact who is in the organization and runs, or at least create the laws or the charter of the organization. Because most of the time, it's the donors, the EU, the US, and all of them, they just come around and just tell them, this is what we are doing in Europe now with democracy, or even the most recent one is climate change. So we see all of these prescriptions. Yeah, you're going to put it in your AU charter, and we're going to ensure that you have funding for the next 2 years to operate. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Ovigwe, for that submission. I mean, when we have the thieves in charge of the coffers, what can we expect? When those who are expected to protect us are the ones killing us. It's a difficult ball game. Okay, I pass the baton now back to Ibrahim to continue from here. Yes, over to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you, sir. I so much love when you made the point that perhaps the best way to start is to ensure further democratization of the ECOWAS itself. I think that could be the missing key here. Imagine if the chairman of ECOWAS is not Mahama, who is now currently the chairman. It's someone who doesn't have like his own presidency to protect. And maybe not so strong, maybe not so strong of a political future to protect. I don't think that president or that chairman of ECOWAS will be so scared to say, "Oh, Alpha Conde, you shouldn't be doing this third time bid or whatnot. It's going to create problem." I don't think they will be so afraid to do it, or to say that. But when you have Mahama or even Alpha Conde as the chair of the ECOWAS, I don't think that will be such language will come from them. So I think that democratization idea within ECOWAS or AU is so valid. But also your point about the over dependence on the EU and their own and this kind of neo-colonial, or you want to call it European hegemony, playing out in our multinational organizations. Like whatever idea that Mahama or even Conde or even Buhari want to share at the ECOWAS or AU meetings will have to have been sanctioned by the US or the EU, we are the primary donors here. I mean, the AU Parliament was built by China, I think. So you can imagine if China is doing some nonsense in Djibouti or whatnot, they can't condemn the Chinese because they'll just send them out of the building in Addis Ababa. But again, I think I want to go back to Dr. Annie's point on the role of the military. And I'm just thinking, okay, I think it was Dr. Ovigwe that said it's not always bad when the military, it's not every situation where the military takes charge that is a bad coup. And that just cast my mind back to our pre-colonial, experience, political experience as Africans, that the military or the army had some political roles to the largest extent that kept the kings or the ruling council in check. I do not know too much about the Igbo society, but I know that in many places in West Africa, the ruling council or even the king cannot go beyond some regard, and if it does, it will be checked by the commander of the army. And considering this pre-colonial past, and considering also Dr. Eguegu's idea of not all coup are bad, how can you define the role, or what should be the ideal role of the military in politics, if at all there should be any? Or if you think that's too much of an explicit expression, what should be the role of the military in relation to executive in West Africa so that we can prevent these, incessant coups, Dr. Annie?
Okay. No, thank you very much. As in, simple and straight answer to that will be no involvement of the military coup military in engagement within the continent. But then the realities have not always been the case that, even when you look at popular uprisings that have happened both in Sudan, Tunisia, Algeria, Zimbabwe, wherever it is, you see that in some way the role of the military, is either they act or they do not act. So in definite ways, there has to be some, as in their role is always critical if we have to have a positive change, because for instance, let me say in Zimbabwe, for instance, they have been protecting Mugabe for a very long time. But then when they realized that their interests are also in jeopardy, then they decided to take out that, allow the change in government, which in many ways you see that it's wrong. But let me come back to something very critical you mentioned around, how do we really ensure change? How many of us are involved in the political party elections to get the person that will have the flag bearer, of the politics out there on the streets campaigning to become the president? I think none of us have, as in for me, from my experience, a lot of us do not really even have control of who comes out as a political head from either from the PDP or the APC. They just recycle leaders and then bring it for us, and we are like, okay, this is it. This is, these are the people. Then we are now faced between voting for either good or bad, as in good or not so bad, So we kind of face in that kind of situation where we have to select whoever is being brought out already from the primary election. So I think also as analysts and things like that, when we think about how do we really effect change, it's also to go down to the grassroots, the political systems. We see that this person have been involved in political crimes and the likes, but we still vote the person in. This person, we still leave the person. When the person comes into power, we say, it's not too bad. Anyway, he just have a couple of criminal records here and there, but it's fine. We can manage him since he's better than the other person, or he's better than the other one that is in power. But if we can change from the political party election itself, then that is where. So I think when we're speaking about the elections and all those things, and also constitutional referendum and changes, we need to also touch on those aspects. That is where the key changes happen. And one last comment around leadership change. We need to also think about, I think somebody also, Ovigwe rightly mentioned about the case of Rwanda, where he has been there sitting down for a while, and then he is doing good, and then people are wondering, is it good for democracy? Is it good or is it bad for democracy? The question could also be asked about Angela Merkel. She has been in power, going from one place for 16 years, being there and then doing something right for their people. And she keeps on being elected. But
no, for their case is stability. For us is bad democracy.
Exactly. But then there are two things to really consider in that, even though we have that in mind, that yes, that could be a trend that if it is done rightly.
Yeah.
The case of Rwanda, for instance, that also that elections, even we wonder ourselves, like, how did that election take place? That you have 94%, of vote, and then there are still opposition figures on board. Now, we think about the future. Let's say when Kagame is not in power, how do we now redefine that? What is happening? Is it about also having institutions that are working, as in or is also about, we go with this individual, he's doing right, and then we keep on going forward? Is it allowed in a constitution where if an individual is doing right, then we keep boosting him? Someone can also manipulate that system and then say, oh, I'm doing right also. I should keep on being supported in that system. So I think a lot of questions are there for us, as in, because it demands a lot of change in a lot of aspects. And to also think about, when we talk about leadership, there's, for instance, the Rwandan president, there's a lot of cases. I lived in South Africa, so I know a lot of Rwandan colleagues who are running away from political challenges in the country and then coming into country. Then you ask yourself, the economic growth at what sacrifice? At that point. You also ask yourself, how will his change? I like his leadership. I like him to remain in power and lead. But how do you make that process a much more legitimate process that will be beneficial, not only for now, because after now, someone may end up in power the next day,
right.
And not having any vision for the country per se. Right. So those are the two things that I wanted to add.
Yeah, you're actually spot on. And I've always been an advocate of African solutions to African problems. If Kagame's style is bringing economic dividends and is actually holding elections, I do not see too much of a problem in that. The only problem is that we have to make sure those elections are actually free and fair. If they are free and fair, people are saying we still want him to be in power. Who are we to say we shouldn't allow people to say whatever they want or to choose whatever leader they want? I think we're having I'm gonna come to you, Dr. Ovigwe, for our last salvo, but I just want to read a few comments here from our friend, Ferdinand from Burundi. He said, what happened to Alpha Conde is a good lesson for African presidents, but some are deaf ears. This is due to the way they access power, and to restore their system, it is necessary that it happens to them, these kind of corrections happen to them. And we have a question, pretty much a comment by one of our own, Yvonne Kiogora, I think from Kenya. She says, today I have learned that not all coups are bad. As freedom lovers and libertarians, how best can we address this kind of issues in our countries to make an impact? And that's going to be my final question to you, Dr. Eguegu. If you can kindly answer it in like a minute or minute and a half. What do you think should be the role of young people like us? Because a lot of people on this call are some of our writing fellows at African Liberty, people who advocate for freedom through writing, publishing in newspapers. Some of them are actually activists, like Bayonle was one of the leaders of the NSAS protests from the zone section of Ibadan. So what do you think should be the role of young people and the civil society? Maybe I'll actually give you the answer, but the role of the locals in countries to prevent these kind of coups in their respective countries. Dr. Eguegu.
Yeah, sorry. Most of the time, my answer don't actually involve civil society. But anyway, just one thing to mention. See, a country is about politics, right? It's not about feelings. It's not about. It's a political organization, and what some of the things we're accusing France of doing. If I was president of Nigeria and I see weaker states, I'll probably do the same thing as well, because that's how the world works. This is realism. You don't run a country with ideas in your head. You run the country based on the practical realities that you have to deal with. And in Africa, one of the most glaring realities we have to deal with is poverty, real abject poverty. And when you talk about countries, when I see people talk about human rights in Rwanda, I always like, you really don't know what the priorities are as a human being if you think we should elevate some of the small concerns of one person is pursued to South Africa, another person is thrown in jail because Kagame has been extreme. In Rwanda, many public offices open by 7 o'clock. I've been there several times. How many of you in your countries here do you have public offices open by 7? Do you know the kind of efficiency that Kagame is displaying? Many African countries don't even come close because there's almost no natural resources in that country. He was running that country economy with tea that he was exporting for about 10 years before they started getting some coltan from, we all know where it's coming from, but definitely not Rwanda. But the point I'm trying to make here is, even while he's doing that, I'm not critical of it. I've been on policy dialogue where we talk about, civil society in Rwanda or in DRC, where's Rwanda getting coltan from? I said, is the coltan being used to create development in an African country? Yes. Then let's have a different conversation, because you want the coltan to be sitting on the ground and then some mining company from China or UK or wherever, they are stealing it and it's not even developing any country. It's going to the ports of Glencore or any of the big multinational, but another fellow in African country is quote unquote stealing it, and that's really your problem. But if a white person is stealing it, it's not your problem, right? But anyway, to circle back, I'm not justifying what is being done. I'm only telling you that if a country is being to be run well, you have to know your priorities. We have right to vote is good, right to freedom of assembly is good. I stand for all of that, and young people everywhere in the world. I'm a young person myself. I always tell people it is very important that we educate ourselves in politics, right, as much as we are shouting about liberty, because sometimes you can be educated by media to act against your own interests without even knowing. I'm telling you, this is real cold fact, because I've developed strategic communication plans for some consultants. You should see some of the things that is being discussed in these spaces. And then we just pick out maybe 4, 5, 3 CSOs and say, okay, fund these guys, fund those guys. Yeah, those guys know how to put pressure on the government. And they go out and they do it, So every African needs to educate themselves on real politics and always ask the question, where is the financing from this campaign? Or this campaign? When the NSAS, one reason why I really love the NSAS process so much was it was financed by everybody. My sister in Canada, she donated $300 and she has not been here in 10 years. But this is crowdfunded. So as young people, we don't have to always complain. We also have to take political action, by organizing, by financing, what we know is good for our interest. And we also don't have to think what is good for young Nigerians is good for young Rwandans and projects, because we're going to be guilty of the same things we're accusing France of doing or any other country of doing. Let every country, a youth in every country, contextualize your activism, because contexts are different across countries. Yes, we have the same problems, but the solutions to our problems differ, in a separate way. So anyway, I can write a thesis on this, but let me just end there and say we have work to do. And one of the work we have to do is not just to shout, but also to very, very well articulate our points, our solutions, and let's be less touchy-feely about things that they really don't matter.
Right. Thanks so much. That's a great point to observe. Again, yeah, you're right. The realities of Africans, it's not unified. As much as we may think of it as unified, it often depends on the locality, and we have to address those local realities the way they should be. So I really agree with that. Again, it's always great to have governments that respect human rights and accounts for whatever things they are selling or whatever way they are making their national revenue. So yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ani, and thank you so much, Dr. Eguegu, and to Bayole, and to each and every one of my colleagues and our friends who tune into this conversation. Again, we so much appreciate your time, and we hope you can join us next month for our next episode, which we will communicate pretty soon. And on that note, I want to say thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yeah, thank you.